or good afternoon, and a very big welcome from IAP2 Canada, IAP2 USA, and IAP2 Australasia, as it is with pleasure today that we get to provide you with a very special learning webinar. It's being done by the IAP2 Canada Research Committee, and it is on state of the practice in Canada. My name is Amelia Shaw. I'm the Executive Manager of IAP2 USA and IAP2 Canada, and it is my extreme pleasure to be your moderator for today's session. So I'm going to introduce both Sherif and Sherry in a few minutes, but before I do that, Drew, over to you for some housekeeping items and how people can be involved in today's session.
Well, there's a number of ways you can be involved in this. It's supposed to be interactive, so you're going to hear from Sherif and Sherry, of course, but also they've got some poll questions, which they'll be asking you to get a feel of, you know, who's listening and what your attitudes are and so forth. So that's coming up. But also we've got questions. You've got questions, very likely. So feel free to either use the question box and type your questions into that, and when it's an appropriate time, Amelia will break in and ask the question for you. Or you can raise your hand. You see that little yellow hand icon thingy there. You can click on that, and we'll see that you would like us to open your microphone. And when we do that, you'll be able to ask the question directly. Speaking of microphones, we're going to keep everybody's mics muted through this. So if you've got them muted, please take them off mute, and we'll take care of that. We keep them on mute so that there's no feedback going back and forth along the line. But also, if somebody wants to ask a question using their microphone, we can just unmute you when the time comes. This is being recorded, so you'll be able to refer back to it for your personal professional development there. We have that on the webinar page in our website for members only, although, of course, in this case, the research committee's reports, the state of the practice survey, the environmental scan, all of that material is available on the public-facing side of the IAP2 website. And so with that, let's hand it back to Amelia to get this party started.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Drew. And we are really pleased that so many of you are joining us for today's session. So with that, I'm going to introduce both Sherif and Sherry, and then I'm going to turn it over to Sherif. So Sherif Kinawy is a member of the IAP2 Canada Great Lakes chapter and one of the founding members of the IAP2 Canada Research Subcommittee. He holds a PhD from the University of Toronto with a focus on community engagement and infrastructure projects. Sherif is passionate about developing sustainable solutions to urban and rural issues through the power of local knowledge, collective learning, and wider collaboration. His previous experiences include work in community development, educational programs, as well as electronic collaboration platforms, and he currently works in the area of sustainable infrastructure management. Sherif is a certified environmental professional on sustainability and environmental management by the Canadian Environmental Certification Approvals Board, and a lead accredited professional in building design and construction. Sherif is going to be joined by Sherry Campbell. Sherry has a PhD leadership in psychology, has been an active member of IAP2 Canada since 2012, and in addition, since 2013, Sherry has enjoyed her involvement as a member of the IAP2 Canada Research Committee and 3 years as a mentor in the mentorship program. Sherry has extensive experience with stakeholder engagement and public participation, communications, and change management initiatives. Currently, she is a communications and outreach expert for a U.S. government project. So with that, Drew, I'm going to ask you to please hand the screen over to Sherif, and we are going to get going with today's presentation.
Hello, everyone.
Hi, Sherif. Good to hear you. Sorry, I think we had a slightly loud noise with as Sherry was joining us, but we've got it all over to you now.
Perfect. So hi, everyone. It's good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. So I wanted to get started with telling you a bit about the committee, and that's the IAP2 Research Subcommittee here in Canada. And then we'll talk a bit about a few of the components. One thing I wanted to start with before we move on was just as Amelia mentioned, while Sherry and I both have PhDs that were part of a bio, but I will be making an announcement at the end. We have a call for volunteers on the committee, But I have to say that a PhD is not a prerequisite, so please do keep that in mind afterwards. And if you do have any kind of interest in bridging research and practice, that's really all you need, along with your commitment. So I'm going to start, and then I'll be introducing Sherry. Now, for the webinar today, we'll walk you a bit through the background of the research subcommittee, our approach, and then linking that to the things that we've done, what we've learned from these things, a bit about some of our next steps, and then we'd like to definitely hear from you about your thoughts about any of the work we've done or anything that's coming up. The research committee was started in 2013, and the purpose was to help members better understand current public participation activities in Canada. So the engagement efforts with members identified a need to increase access to research journals, for example, other things like training, workshops, training manuals, any kind of other mechanisms that would help to transfer knowledge between different disciplines within organizations. Now, we wanted to focus on public participation trends and best practices, and by doing that, we wanted to look at mostly areas of innovation. So you'll see that within the different activities we've looked a lot on things like social media and digital media as things that enable public participation. Now, each year, the committee devises an action plan. And that's something that we look at, and we link that so that it would fulfill the IAP2 Canada strategic outcome. Especially, if I quote, in this case, it's IAP2 Canada as a source and developer of knowledge and resources. And that's something that we strive to always look to and try to go towards. Now, as I said, we are recruiting volunteers at this point to join our team. So please visit IAP2 Canada website. I advise you to do that this week and definitely apply. And I'm happy to answer any questions about that either at the end of the webinar or afterwards. Now, to get to what we wanted to achieve here as a committee, our approach used qualitative and quantitative questions. So a lot of what we did was reaching out through surveys, and that was to IAP2 members and non-members, trying to get at the body of practitioners and trying to understand what are some of the things that they wanted to see. We also augmented that by an environmental scan, and that was focused on the different organizations and initiatives that are comparable to IAP2, and trying to see afterwards what kind of collaboration we can work towards with some of them. So the environmental scan, which Sherry will be speaking to in a bit more detail, but basically, as a basic idea, if you see it in front of you here, the sector's resources is what we wanted to look at. And that was something we're taking in, and in the end, trying to see how we can come up with a result that would show us, as a concept, challenges, opportunities, or anything else we can face. And that was by looking at what was out there in terms of partner organizations. So that was one aspect. Another aspect we talked about was our needs assessment, and that was satisfied using a number of things. So you see in the center here we have the IAP2 Canada State of the Practice Survey, which I will be speaking to in a bit. However, we also included information from the IAP2 Canada member survey, and that's something that's done. We did that back in 2013 or 2012. That was done in conjunction with the first State of the Practice survey. However, all of these surveys have now been ongoing, as I will speak to them later, and the information that we get from the member survey and the State of the Practice survey are both quite pivotal to how we can get some kind of a descriptive understanding of the current state, so that we can know what problems are facing the practice and link that to the research that's out there. So with that, I'll introduce Sherry, who will speak to the environmental scan results before I come back, and we'll be talking again about the survey.
Hello, this is Sherry speaking. I'm happy to speak to you about our environmental scan. This is an update of the previous environmental scan that we published on our IAP2 Canada website in 2014. The scan in 2016 to 2017 reviewed changes in activities of organizations that were already on the list and added new organizations. We were looking at like initiatives or member organizations, and specifically in a number of regions. So Western and Eastern region, and Canada-wide organizations, and also upon the request of members, the inclusion of international organizations. We reviewed over 100 websites to both confirm and validate the information that was on the list, and also communicated with organizations to determine the intent of their P2 activities, whether they were still active, or in some cases the organizations had a particular focus in their P2 activities and research, and also their interest and capacity to partner with IAP2 Canada. That is, have they collaborated with other organizations in the recent past? Are they interested in doing so? And what sort of resources from a human and financial aspect might they have that could be shared in a partner relationship with our research group? Also, our members, our chapter members, provided referrals for organizations they were aware of in the region. And this has really helped us to broaden the scope of our review to ensure that it's as comprehensive as possible. Secondly, and I think this is probably on the next slide, I think Sherif or whoever's, no, sorry, not Sherif. Drew, are you? There we go. Okay, so secondly, the organizations are identified in this inventory, and keep in mind this inventory is rather heavy. It's many pages long. For each of the region, we've compiled a lot of information on their P2 research and activities. As well as a rating system, or looking at their high, medium, or low rating based on what are the current activities and resources currently devoted to P2 research, and secondly, what is their capacity to be a research partner. You can look at the entire document at the link listed below. And anyone who's really interested might like to do so, as it would be difficult to look at it online here. It's rather dense, and you know what Excel spreadsheets tend to look like. However, there is the September 2017 Environmental Scan Report, which summarizes the information nicely, located in that link as well. So it will provide you with a sense of the criteria that we used, and also the organizations in Western and Eastern Canada, Canada-wide and internationally, who were given a high rating. That is, high for their devotion and commitment to P2 research and activities, and high in on the basis of their capacity to be a potential research partner with IAP2 Canada. And you may be wondering, why are we looking at the idea of research partner? And it's both to expand our knowledge base of P2 research and activities and potentially share those with members, and also to enrich our collaboration with other P2 organizations in Canada. Next slide, I think. Oh, I think that's pretty much it. So the only things I would add here to end on the environmental scan is to let you know that there's been an increase since the 2014 environmental scan in the number of organizations identified as high for P2 activities and research and potential for collaboration. So this is really good news in terms of our practice, in terms of the scope of P2 research and activities in Canada. Also that we continue to focus on these two criteria. So the one is the practice, collection, and conducting of P2 research, and the collaboration and shared resources that can help us to provide further knowledge base and development for our P2 members. So I thank you, and I want to add to what Sherif has said. We really do extend a hand to you to volunteer to be part of our committee. Thank you.
Thank you, Sherry. And to make sure that at this point you all know where we're at, so one of the big initiatives that we went through as the IAP2 research subcommittee was the environmental scan, and that was done again, one that was completed recently and another one that was completed about 3 years ago. So very interesting results that we got from that. As Sherry mentioned, we managed to expand our reach and all the opportunities that we can achieve through that. Now, the second component that I will speak to now is the state of public participation practice in Canada, which I will be referring to as the state of P2 practice in Canada. So I thought it would be a good idea to do a bit of a recap on our 2013 survey, which was the first one that we conducted in that space. And then I will be talking about the 2017 one, which was completed recently. And it will give you a good idea on perhaps what changed and what did not, which was quite interesting to us. So the survey as a whole was directed at P2 practitioners at large within Canada. But I believe that even if some members of the audience are not practicing within Canada, there are a lot of insights to get out of the survey that can be applied a bit more generally. So the survey had a number of objectives, and the three main ones here were mainly bridging P2 research and practice, as I mentioned. The second is determining priority areas for the research subcommittee. And then within the third, we wanted to get at two things. One of them was advising the IAP2 Canada board on the needs of members and non-member practitioners, because that was something that was going to direct the kind of work beyond the research subcommittee. And then also informing trainers on the needs of practitioners. And that was something that was interesting because trainers are a big part of the community that we have within IAP2 and within the P2 practice. So a lot of people will end up going through one or two training sessions before they establish themselves within the field. And that was something that we wanted to make sure was well tied in so that the training that was provided was hitting those important points. Now, the survey was meant to shed some light on the patterns and provide direction to the board, as I said. But more importantly, we wanted to answer some questions about aspects that needed to be addressed by current and future research and training. And especially if you think about it, if there's a professor who's working on research in the P2 area, and they want to know what the practice is saying, this will be a good way to portray that to them. And on the other hand, some of the work we do does the opposite, where people in practice can get access to things that we produce as the research subcommittee, where like white papers that talk about some of what research is doing. And then that's something I'll probably speak to a bit at the end. So coming back to the survey, in 2013, if I start from the end here and tell you a bit about what came out of it, and then dive not too deep, but just quickly into the different questions that we asked and the structure. So what we got out of it was, at that point, 86 responses, and we identified 4 focus areas. A big one was conflict management, and Then we also saw emphasis on having some standards for effectiveness and evaluation. So that's something you've probably come across, the big question of identifying what a good P2 process is. And then social media, web-based and mobile technologies, and that's something we stressed again in the survey that we just finished. And finally, engaging top-level management. So this was the case where there were a lot of P2 practitioners within organizations that had a hard time convincing decision makers and top-level management to make any kinds of changes to their decisions, or even in some cases integrate public participation within the process. Now that was very interesting to us because we took that information and we looked at some of these topics and we thought, okay, so obviously social media, web-based and mobile technologies are important. And at this point, we're in the process of producing a white paper in collaboration with several writers we have from practice and research. And one of them is focusing on digital P2 specifically. So the cornerstones of P2 in this case is looking at good quality engagement and then how digital engagement enhances the techniques you already use to engage communities. So this is a paper that will be coming out soon. So definitely stay tuned. You'll see it on the newsletter when it comes out, and it will be published as well for members. Now, let me go back to the survey and touch on how we came about in terms of structure and to produce a survey and circulate it. So the survey was published in French and English. It was available online so that we could get some good reach. And we split it into 4 sections. The first one was talking about respondents' information. So we asked them about geographically where they were working, what kinds of sectors they touched in their projects, whether they worked for the public sector or the private sector, and other kinds of information like that. We also, in the second section, focused on the effectiveness. So we had a few statements that focused on how effective the P2 process was, and I'll go through some of the results of that. And then the third one was tools and techniques as they're defined by IAP2. So we wanted to ask them what tools they use the most, which ones they use the least. A lot of these questions were ranking questions. And then the last one was limitations. So we wanted to find out again what enabled the P2 process for them and what hindered it. So, for example, they mentioned things like technology, like whether projects were technical or too technical to communicate, and other aspects of projects that were hindrances in some cases. So let's talk a bit about what we noticed in there. So for our findings, a large number of respondents identified Alberta or Ontario, so that was 40% each, as the region of operation. We also had representation from all Canadian provinces and territories, and some of our respondents were also working, in addition to being in Canada, internationally. We also saw that 80% of respondents selected the public sector as their primary sector, while about a quarter selected the private sector, and then in the not-for-profit sector we had about 23%. So this acknowledges that many of the P2 practitioners have roles that span several sectors and involve wearing different hats, and we did allow them to mention that within their choices. We saw, for example, when we asked about project types, that there was quite a good spread all the way from policy, as you can see, land use planning, community development, energy projects, which had about 30 to 50% involvement from our respondents in each of these. Now, when we asked about some of the techniques they use, especially, we noticed that open houses or town halls and public meetings, although we used that we thought those would be, again, and that was back in 2013, ones that people were using less and less so, but it did indicate that people were still using open houses and town halls and public meetings, usually a lot more than you would think. And that could say something to their effectiveness. When it came to the most commonly used tools, so this is again, the definition of a tool here will be something like facilitation, or what kind of material you use, or whether you're using a website versus something else. And in this case, it was very obvious that online material and web tools were gaining an edge back in 2013. Yet we also saw a big need for facilitation and consensus building, and there were still responses that indicated that printed material was something to rely on. Now, we also asked at that point if there were any techniques for controversial projects. So if you thought there was something, the question was asking about whether there was a project that was thought of as a controversial topic, where they expected a bit of conflict to occur. What were the tools and techniques that they went to at that point? And in this case, it was obvious that they wanted to take people on site tours. There was a way of doing that, work cafes and workshops. And you notice that a lot of these were face-to-face with a lot of physical presence, which seemed to work well in those cases. Now, the criteria for selecting techniques is something else we asked about. And they indicated that collaborative deliberation and accessibility was something that they wanted to use often as a measure of whether they wanted to use a technique within a project. So to highlight again on some of the barriers in this case, which was the fourth section on 2013 in the survey, they mentioned that the most commonly encountered ones were managing conflict, there was equity in representation, and engaging citizens beyond planning. You will notice that as I present 2017, we did focus on the equity part, which had not come up in 2013 in any of the questions. It did come as a response, but we wanted to see in 2017 whether we could have something that talked about equity and how that can be something we can look at in this sense and try to dive deeper into it. So the least commonly encountered one was really updating regulations, because the question was if regulations are updated to facilitate the use of web tools. For example, if you're able to take records from Twitter or Facebook and use those as official records, would that help you within your process? And that did not seem to be a major barrier for most of the respondents. So now for the 2017 survey, what we had here is a lot of the same objectives that you see. We conducted the survey in 2016, closed it in the beginning of 2017. It was launched at the IAP2 conference in Montreal last year. Again, we try to focus on the same points, trying to have this drive the same objectives that would help IAP2 at large. This time, we offered it again in English and French. We had 100 responses that were received, so significantly more than last time. And the focus areas had a bit of a different trend here. So let me talk about that before I jump into some of the results we had within the survey. So you would remember conflict management as something that came up in the 2013 survey. That definitely came up again as an important topic to look at, and it is one that's arguably a quite difficult one for researchers and practitioners to talk about. And the other two, so the first and third, are mostly dealing with alignment here. So if you look at the first one, tools and techniques that support achieving equality in community representation. So this was the idea of any kinds of techniques or tools that you can use and that have a successful track record into helping, whether it's equality from the sense of minorities or second language speakers, or even representation within meetings. So if you're talking about lower income groups, if you're talking about students, or even within a specific neighborhood, if a certain neighborhood is a big part of a project but not well represented. And then the third point was alignment. So the alignment, integration, and management of online engagement tools. The idea was to make sure that when you're reaching out using especially online engagement tools, that you have a P2 process where the content is aligned between what you're presenting to the public and what you're getting back. And it's not just content, but also the main objectives, the sentiment. So it's something I'd love to hear about in the end as well when we come to questions. Perhaps if anyone has examples of things that resonate with any of these, I would love to hear some of these examples. Now, as you see, the 4 sections that we had were exactly the same, yet the questions within were different from the 2013 survey. So in terms of geography, we had a large number of respondents who identified Alberta, BC, or Ontario as the region. And again, we had most respondents selecting the public sector. However, when it came to the primary roles, this time we saw a lot more presence from everyone who identified themselves as public participation specialists or facilitators. So that was a lot of what we got in terms of representation. So before we proceed, I just wanted to have a quick poll to check quickly on in terms of sector, what most of the audience here would identify with. So if we can draw that poll quickly, and I'll make sure that you have some time to look at that.
Thanks, Sherif. So we do have the poll question up here at the moment. Which sector represents your primary type of involvement in P2? And we're just going to ask you to select one, whether you're public sector, elected or staff, private sector, not-for-profit, or other. And if it is other, then we would please ask you to put those ideas in the question box so that we can report back to Sherif. So maybe just a couple more seconds. And Drew, if you could close that, please. So we have the results. And Sherif, on the line with you today are about 64% from the public sector, 36% and 36% from the private sector. So today we're split between public and private sector. Nobody from not-for-profit, and nobody has put in other. So that's your audience.
Great, thank you very much, Amelia. So that's a very interesting split that we have, and quite a good representation. But in the survey, something to note as we go through these results is that we had a lot more on the public sector side. So again, it will be very interesting to see as we go through some of the other results, what perhaps resonated with you, especially if you were in the public sector. And if you are working as part of the private sector, that would be really interesting to see which of these you think would possibly be represented differently. Now, as you remember, the first part that we had was asking about the process effectiveness. And one of the biggest questions that we had was just an outright question about whether P2 is often used to delegate decision-making to the public. So that's a direct question. We will want to see how if people actually, so if it's not just effective, but is it actually being used? Because when we ask practitioners if they think P2 is effective, naturally, if you're practicing it, you're probably bound to think that it is effective. But in this case, when we asked whether it was often used for delegating decision making, so this is a case where the people are actually given the power to make decisions. You can see that there was a lot of disagreement in orange here, depending on how your screen shows the color. But on the left side, there's a big bar next to it, another bar. So more than half that agreed that this was not the case, where we're not really at a stage where there's full delegation. And keep in mind, people are involved in all different kinds of projects, and it can be the case that maybe that is not a delegation. In that case, full delegation to the public is not something that is possible at all. But there are other cases where it might be just a matter of their belief in whether members of the community are ready to make a decision, an informed decision in that case. So it was interesting to see that. On the other hand, when we asked them whether P2 is often used to extract local knowledge and understand issues and concerns, you could see that there was a lot more agreement. Quite a majority of people thought it was either strongly or somewhat, they were in agreement with that. So that was something on the other end of the spectrum. Now in the reports, you'll be able to see a lot of the other statements that we had in there. I just wanted to highlight these two. And on the next page, I also, on this slide, I wanted to highlight an interesting one. So the second one here that we have, which was a question about whether public feedback rarely affects the outcome of the project. So you can see in this case, we use the language that used rarely instead of often. I wanted to see what people thought of that, and it is something people agreed with mostly. However, we had quite a lot of people also disagreed. So if you see it that way, it's interesting that despite people thinking that P2 was not used to delegate decision making, yet when we asked them whether it really affected the outcome, they said, you know what? No, we actually disagree, somewhat disagree or strongly disagree, and it might have an effect on the outcome. So that was something that was positive to see, but we have yet to see whether that is an accurate reflection of what everyone believes. And I'm happy to take your questions on any of these at the end. But I wanted to jump to the tools and techniques section, which was our third section. So these questions that will be coming up were mostly ranking questions. So they were able to talk about more than one. And before I show you this full one, I wanted to actually put our second poll on.
Thank you very much, Sherif. So the second poll question is up there. Which technique do you expect is most often used to include non-native English or French speakers in a P2 process? And your choices are to provide an interpreter, consult community associations, conduct P2 sessions in another language, provide online and social media engagement in other languages. So we'll just give our participants an opportunity to respond. And Drew, let's close that down and see what the answers are. So Sherif, for your information, 18% of our audience provide interpreters, 55% of our audience provide or work with community associations, 9% conduct P2 sessions in another language, and 18% provide online or social media engagement in other languages. So 18% for interpreters, 55% for community associations, 9% for another language, and 18% for online and social media engagement. Back to you.
Thank you, Amelia. So if we have another look at what we have here, that was quite interesting because what we saw from our results was that the biggest number of people either had some other technique, and within the other, it's something you can definitely see in a bit more detail in the report. Some could be really distributed in any of these groups, but mostly they wanted to mention something that had to do with using certain kinds of tools or special tools that you use within. So the question about techniques here, you see that consulting community associations in Canada was something that they used, especially when the issue was not just the language, but also an ethnic concentration in a certain neighborhood. So that seemed to be something where they decided to go ahead and use a community association because it included the language and the cultural aspects together. So that was, I believe, one that when we polled the audience here today was not used as much. To be honest, personally, I expected interpreters to be used more often, and I expected the online engagement or social tools to be used less often, because I thought it would be something that would not be as facilitating to the process. That was my personal expectation. I was proven perhaps right on the social one, but I was proven wrong on the interpreters.
Yeah.
And it seems from the poll that we conducted that it was interpreters and online tools that were the most, right?
No, actually, community associations was at 55%. So by far, that was the biggest.
That was 55%.
Yeah,
okay.
55% from our participants on the line today. So it seems almost very similar to the results that you're getting on your survey as well, Sherif.
Very interesting. So I misheard that. My apologies. So that was interesting to see to me, and interesting for me to hear right now with the poll as well. So perhaps that's a question we might get back to at the end in a few minutes.
Sherif,
now, when we asked them about...
Sorry.
Yes.
Sherif, just before you move on, we do have a quick question specifically about this slide. One of our participants is trying to understand the numbers 1 to 4. What do you mean by that?
Right. Thank you for this question because it relates to the other ones coming up as well. As I mentioned in the very beginning for tools and techniques, these were ranking questions because we realize people often use more than one technique. It's not something where they use just the one. So people were asked to rank their top 5, and this is basically where it says that, for example, for providing interpreters, it was 50, so about 18% where it was most commonly used, or whether it was least commonly used. So that's where they were asked to choose most common or least common as the tools for each of these.
Excellent.
So
Thank you so much for that.
Provides. That means that, yeah, and that would come up again with tools, and it's absolutely described in a bit more detail within the report. So for tools, so we have the same. In this case, we just called it most often and least often. So this would be which of these would be used most often and least often. And you can see here right away, if I look at the blue, which is at the bottom, that facilitation or consensus building is, again, still one of the tools that people use and rely on quite heavily. But then you'll also see that web tools were some of the ones that were used most often, and that's in agreement with the 2013 survey. It's always very refreshing for me to see printed materials making the rounds and still in there, because let's face it, it is something that is heavily used. It's quite a base. It provides good documentation. It's something very tangible that people can take with them. So for me, I never planned a survey so that this would come up. As neutral as we try to make it, printed material will always be there despite our focus on trying to touch on social media. Now, for the last question we had for web-based or mobile tools. So in this case, we asked them if you use web-based or mobile tools, because not everyone does. But if you do, then which of the tools listed here have you used most often? So again, the blue at the bottom, followed by the red and the green, and then the purple and the light blue. So these are the ones you see that web-based online, which is just a web page basically, was the one that was used the most, and it is mostly just a basic way of doing it. Something to mention here is the terms used by people for different things are different. So, for example, while blogs and Twitter, if you look at research and papers, they would call Twitter a micro-blogging website because that's the type. A lot of practitioners were not really used to the term, and they wanted to talk about rather certain software. So that's why if someone used something that is similar to Twitter, but it was not Twitter per se, that was something that went into other. So as you read the results, especially for this section for web-based or mobile tools, just keep that in mind, that I would say it's not as conclusive, and it's mostly because people were relying on certain brand names when it came to what choice they had. But at least the web-based part, the first bar you see, it's quite an indication of how it's still a matter of using websites and listing information on websites that could be static or a bit dynamic. That's still the major part of the trend here. Now for barriers and limitations, in this case, we asked about the most recent project and asked which barriers needed to be overcome or steps that needed to be overtaken to be taken to achieve a more effective P2 process. So you see that equity and community representation, which was one of the options there, was one that was chosen the most, followed by managing conflict. And you see that obviously was one of the main items that that fed into our recommendations, which would drive what we're trying to focus on later on in terms of our work through the research subcommittee. Now, when we asked them again if they had any challenges that they face when they use web-based or mobile technologies, so in this case, you see that, so blue in this case is never, but we also had if I looked at conflict situations. So it's something that was interesting because, sorry, what I wanted to, yeah, so, or even looking at, so that's one where we had some people say, you know what, conflict situations never, or sometimes, but there were other cases where it was quite inconclusive, where with a lot of people saying we can't measure whether that actually increased conflict situations or not. You get told a lot probably that if you use Facebook or Twitter, that gives people a chance to troll or to because it's not face-to-face, they can get into conversations that take things on a tangent. So that's something that people were not able to conclusively say. However, the last line here, he says staff members were not well trained. And that one, in addition to the first point where technical information was hard to present electronically, those were two of the most that I see here, in addition to the other ones where people were saying it's a lot. That's one that we face a lot. But if you look at the data for this question, it's a bit hard to say which was the top. But staff members were not well trained is one that definitely came out again in the 2013 survey, and this time again. So I wanted to highlight that for you as you read through the report. Now it's time for the last poll question, and then I'll be happy to wrap up, tell you about next steps, and get some of your questions.
Thank you so much, Sherif. So do you think that staff training is a main barrier when using web-based or mobile tools in your projects? You certainly heard from some of the participants in the 2017 survey, but this is our opportunity to hear from you and your thoughts online. So Drew, I think we're going to close this up and let's see what the results are. So the result, Sherif, to whether or not staff training is a barrier, 73% said yes. So it's huge. It's very significant. 73% said yes, and 27% said no. So 73% of our audience do believe that staff training is a main barrier when using web-based or mobile tools in your projects. So back to you.
Thank you, Amelia. And thank you for your responses. And I understand that this is a big question to answer with a yes, no. So I know a lot of you in your minds, you're probably thinking yes, but, or no, but. And that would be, I'd be interested in some of the thoughts on that as well. Now, to summarize our analysis and insights from the 2017 survey. So as I said, a large proportion of our respondents agreed the value of P2 is something that is present, and it does facilitate the process, any process that encompasses it. So for example, if it's an environmental assessment, we think this is a big part of it. But behind the scenes, we know that from other responses, people still think that there is some work to be done on making sure that decisions actually take that into account. Now, the top-ranked technique, as we know, is consulting community associations when it came to engaging non-native English and French speakers. This was a new question that we had this time, and I'm glad we had it in because we wanted to touch on that topic, especially within a lot of the cities that are quite multicultural within Canada, and try to see how we can touch on that. So this was one of our pilot questions, and I'm happy to take any recommendations on that question. For the third point, we had, again, online surveys and questionnaires and polls were the most commonly used ones with regards to using any kind of online one. And then finally, when it came to barriers, so as you know, equality and community representation was one that was listed here as the most commonly encountered barrier. It seemed like it left a lot of people thinking we had a good process, but I'm not sure whether I established some kind of equality or equity, depending on how you define the words. That was it for the survey. And before we move on to questions, we wanted to quickly just put out a few questions. So whether you are a current member of IAP2 or not, we'd like to hear from you on what I presented and what Sherif presented, on how you think this benefits you as a member. If you think that something resonated with you, that would be great. If you think you disagree with something, that would be great to hear from you. And also whether this meets your expectations. Finally, I'd like to say thank you for listening, and I want to make sure that that you know again that we are open for volunteers, and we're happy to have you on. And as I said, you don't have to have a research background to engage with us, but we'd be happy to make sure that we take your enthusiasm and your energy and make sure that that would contribute to the good work we produce. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Sherif, and thank you, Sherry, as well. Some of you may be aware that IAP2 Canada currently is the only one with a research committee, but we are hoping to expand both within Canada, and I know that both the United States and Australasia are also looking to see whether or not they'll create a research committee. But we need to make sure that this information is valuable to you. Is this the kind of information that you want as you're thinking about how do you create your own public participation plan, or how do you respond to your projects? It really gives us sort of a snapshot of what's happening within Canada, and we want to make sure that this is useful information. So whether you respond to Sherif right now or whether you respond to us at a later date, we would appreciate this insight. Our research committee works extremely hard trying to understand what's happening in Canada, and they want to make sure that that it's useful information. So please don't hesitate to let us know. As I said, if there's anyone that would like to respond by opening up your mic, just let us know by raising your hand, or if you have anything else, please don't hesitate to answer, pop it into the question box. So Sherif and Sherry, we haven't had any questions or anything at the moment. I think everyone's probably considering the tremendous amount of information that you've already provided to us. Is this your last slide, or is there another slide coming?
My last slide, but while people are still thinking, just in case they have questions, if it's okay with everyone, I just wanted to speak to another white paper that we have. Is that a good time to talk about it?
Absolutely.
Amelia?
Please do.
Perfect. So because decision maker support was something that came up, and we wanted to pursue that, so I wanted to highlight that we have a white paper titled Decision Maker Support for Public Engagement. Why do we need it, and how do we get it? It's written by Colleen Agarou, and it was facilitated by the IAP2 Research Subcommittee. So this is a paper you can check out, and it explores public participation research to help members of IAP2 understand the reasons why decision makers in the government and other contexts lack support for public engagement, and how this would impact decisions. So I highly recommend that you would check out the white paper.
Excellent. And the white papers are certainly on the Canadian and American websites, so please don't hesitate to go to the websites for the full ones, because you've now had 3 white papers that have already been produced. We certainly had evaluation, conflict management, and as you've just indicated, how to encourage senior members within your organization to consider P2. And certainly coming out in October will be social media and public participation. So we will have 4 white papers available for you before the end of the year. The other thing to mention is in our October newsletter, we're also going to be highlighting the environmental scan and the survey that you've just heard a little bit more about. So we will be coming out with those reports. We're going to be launching them in our October newsletter. So you will also find them online at that point in time. So I'm just trying to see if we have any other questions. Let me just see. So someone's just asked whether or not we're going to plan any direct trainings or conference sessions based on these results. It seems like there are several areas to explore. Any thoughts on that, either Sherry or Sherif?
Well, I'll speak to that, and perhaps until Sherry chimes in. So we're definitely planning on informing the board as to what kind of training would be something we'd like to support, but it's something that's up to IAP2 in general as to how to deliver that. So the delivery aspect it will be different, but in terms of perhaps directing what kind of papers and knowledge transfer we can facilitate, or what kind of webinars we can perhaps facilitate, that's something we're definitely looking at. The white papers, some of which I mentioned, and some of which will hopefully be coming out, are one way of doing that, where we've actually reached out to, so a lot of the names you see are people who are either trainers or researchers, and told them to write and produce some case studies on what they've come across that will touch on this topic. So it's definitely on our agenda, but the delivery would be a bit of a bigger decision to make with the IAP2 board.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. And before we sign off, because I'm going to come back to both you and Sherry in a minute, Sherif, I just want to remind everybody about our upcoming October webinar, and we're excited to present the winners of the 2017 IAP2 Core Value Awards for Organization of the Year in Canada and the United States. We're going to be welcoming Michelle Dwyer and Donna Kell from the City of Burlington, Ontario, and hear how they've made P2 part of the culture at City Hall, and Deanna DeSatis from the San Francisco Municipal Transportation Agency will describe how engaging the people has turned her system into one of the top in North America. And just a quick reminder, that's going to be happening on Tuesday, October the 10th at 11 a.m. Pacific. So we would encourage everyone to head to their affiliate website, and please make sure you sign up for this award-winning webinar. And with that, I want to come back to Sherry and Sherif just for some final words before we sign off. So Sherry, why don't we start with you, and then we'll complete with Sherif. Sherry.
Thank you. I'd like to ask those who are attending today if they have any questions to please forward them. I think likely the easiest is to forward them to you, Amelia. Is that correct?
Yes, if they just come to info@IAP2Canada.ca, info@IAP2Canada.ca, and we can send them on to you.
Great. And I'm thinking that you may have questions on the environmental scan in terms of organizations that are already included in our list. And perhaps you may have suggestions on other organizations that you are becoming aware of that are starting to become active in this area. So we continue to welcome your input. And thank you. And also, if you have any questions around information regarding organizations and the type of P2 activities that they're involved in, some of you, our members, certainly will be or may be interested in engaging in research yourself with some organizations, and be interested in which organizations tend to be conducting what type of P2 research. So invite those questions as well. I'd like to thank everyone very much for attending today, and thank you, Amelia, for, as always, a stellar job of facilitating. And I'll turn it over to you, Sherif.
Thanks, Sherry.
Thank you, Sherry. And to reiterate, I wanted to say the survey and everything else that we have gives us just a snapshot that we can only get every 3 or 4 years or so. But I think a lot of the feedback that we get would really be through you if you contact us directly with anything that you have in terms of research needs or any topics that you think you'd like to get covered. So that would be very much appreciated. And thank you.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Sherif and Sherry. So on behalf of IAP2 Canada, IAP2 USA, and IAP2 Australasia, we really do want to thank you for this research. It's great to know what's happening certainly in our country, and I know through the environmental scan, North America and internationally as well. So as mentioned, we will be showcasing this in our October newsletter. So we look forward to providing you with more information. And most importantly, if you want to be a member of the research committee, the call for volunteers is up on the IAP2 Canada website right now. And if I remember correctly, it completes at the end of the day on Friday. So if you want to be part of this group, please make sure you volunteer. Thank you so very much to everyone for attending today. We hope that you have a wonderful day, and we'll see you again on October the 10th at 11 a.m. Pacific for our webinar on Organization of the Year. Thank you, everyone. Take care. Bye-bye now.